Hello, Comp 2. Welcome to our third to last week, I guess. We have 2 more full weeks of class and then a half a week until May 13th when your final assignments are due. So between this Monday, April 27th, and next May 4th, we have 1 full week, and then another week after that, and then a couple of days just to wrap things up as you turn in your final assignments. So this video is going to be relatively short. I'm going to kind of review again what our course is looking like for the next 2 weeks and things to be looking for in your final assignment. So I'm going to start screen share first. After that, after going over some of your final assignments, I'll give you a brief introduction to the stories and poems that you'll be reading for this week. So let's look first at our Moodle page. The structure of our Moodle page will look the same for the next couple of weeks. Hopefully you're getting used to this. Hopefully this is starting to feel familiar. You'll see your assignment that you read, look at your text list, Carver through Jackson, and watch the weekly video that we're looking at right now. And then the class discussion on Wednesday, April 27th. Hopefully you can come in during your class time, either at 9:30 or 12:30. And as a side note, if you can't make one, but you can make the other, feel free to jump on in. That's absolutely fine. And we'll specifically discuss these stories and poems from your text list. And I'll end the video by going over these a little bit more in depth. You will notice that there's one poem, a very brief poem, that if there's not a page number on your text list, that means that I'm going to provide it for you. So this week there's one Moodle, or one link that's here under reading resources. Next week there will be quite a few links to poems that I've assigned that aren't in your textbook. So just kind of be aware of that. If there's not a page number on your text list, that means that I'm providing it for you. The rest of these stories are in your textbook. And then your writing assignment for the week. Hopefully you're wrapping up your normal journal assignments now, or you've already wrapped it up. Please do be keeping up with your journal addendum assignment. So that's what you're tacking on to the end of your journal. You don't turn it in separately. I will be grading it as part of your journal and taking also into account the Zoom participation if you've been able to come to Zoom classes. So again, it's not a problem if you can't come into the Zoom classes, but I do expect more brief reflections at the end of your journal for your readings. So you can show, and I know, and I can read your thoughts as well, that you've stayed engaged in the class and the readings. And at this point, especially once you've looked at next week's readings, you should be able to be thinking about and preparing for your final essay, which is your final exam in this class, and also be doing a bit with the found poem. So again, here's the week. Here are the 2 Zoom class meetings. I will also email those to you. The reading resources. So this week I've given you the poem that's assigned, an article and a short video of Margaret Atwood, who for this week you're reading a short story and a poem by Margaret Atwood that aren't particularly dystopian, but you're also reading dystopian fiction this week. So Atwood is perhaps most famous for writing The Handmaid's Tale, and which is an example of dystopian fiction. So in this article, she talks about what inspired her to write dystopian fiction. And so I thought it was a nice kind of segue between reading some of her writing, but then also thinking about dystopia. And then this is a nice kind of brief article from that masterclass website about dystopian fiction, which again is typically, it's very popular right now. We'll talk about dystopian fiction in our classes on Wednesday, but it gives you kind of some academic context for what dystopian fiction is and what it looks like. This looks familiar, these final assignments and the links. I will just drag and drop those each week. So it's always kind of right in front of you. You know what's coming up, you know what to look for. And so I wanted to look once more at the final essay assignment. specifically the second page, which is a bit of a checklist. So you'll notice that I've graded your Othello essays. So those comments and your grades are up in Moodle now. I gave brief comments, and some of them might be specific to writing about Shakespeare. Shakespeare in-text citations are a little bit different. They have kind of their own rules. But some of the feedback I gave you on that essay, you're going to want to hold on to make sure you improve for your final essay. Specifically about kind of integrating quotes smoothly, jumping right in your introduction, just like jump into your analysis, grab your reader, say something interesting, and also avoid relying heavily on summary. With literary analysis, you can assume that your reader, your audience, knows about the story or the poem, kind of has the basic grasp of it. You do not need to retell the plot. You want to jump into analysis. So keep that in mind. I think it's very instinctive for us to, in our introduction, I call it circling the drain, where you start with this kind of big, broad statement and vague idea, and then finally get to your point. If you want to write that in a first draft, that's fine, but take it out of there. Just jump right into your analysis. So use these checklists. This is on page 2 of your final essay assignment. Make sure you have a creative title. Make sure your introduction really grips your reader and includes the titles and the author's names of whatever text you're dealing with. Make sure that you organize well. When you write a comparative analysis, there are 2 different ways you might organize your essay. You might focus all on one text and then compare all the points to another text. Or you might deal text by text in one paragraph, kind of point A about text 1, point A about text 2, all in one paragraph. Neither is right or wrong. It kind of depends on your topic and the text you're working with and how you want to organize your thoughts and what works most smoothly to make your point. Quotations. Use direct quotes. Do not drop them. Integrate them into your writing and cite them properly. Remember that if you quote poetry or verse and there's a line break, use a slash to indicate the line break. And then in the in-text citation, you would put line numbers. So if you're working with a poem or verse, in the case of Shakespeare, know that like, okay, I got to do something different here. And that you'll need to include that slash for line breaks. Ask me if you have any questions about that. Be sure to analyze. Analyze, don't summarize. Verb tenses. So when we're writing literary analysis, even though you all just wrote about Othello, which was written and performed more than 400 years ago, the idea is that you write in present tense because we're constantly saying new things about art and literature. So we treat these texts like they are living documents. So use present tense verbs. Evaluate. Again, you're not saying that something is good or bad, but digging into kind of the merits and the meaning of a text. And make sure that you use MLA style, works cited page and in-text citation, and paper format. And then this second part of the page, these are things that I've gathered together that I most often correct on essays. So if you can kind of use this as a checklist, make sure that you don't say, I think, or in my opinion, you get that out of there and make your argument. Integrate quotes, strong intros, strong conclusion, including the in-text citation. And there I've given you some of those kind of pointers and examples about poetry versus prose, and then a works cited page. So please use this document as a bit of a checklist to make sure that you are adhering to those guidelines and writing the best essay you can. Because again, this final essay, the final comparative analysis, while it's perhaps just going to be 3 to 4 pages, you might just have 2 sources. This is your final exam. This is your grand finale where you show off everything you've learned this semester and you do the best analysis and best writing that you can. So please be able to focus a lot of your energies in on that. And like I've said in the past, as you're going through your text list and looking for ideas, please don't just choose what sounds easy. You will be bored and then you'll write a boring essay. So students typically enjoy this assignment the most and do the best job when they dig deep and find texts that interest them, that they feel like they're kind of saying something new and unique about. So be creative. Again, that final essay, that's where you pour your creative energy. The found poem, I looked around, somebody asked me to look at an example, and I looked around to try to find a good example of a found poem, and I was kind of coming up empty, and not really wanting to kind of feed you an example like this is exactly what it should look like. Because the point of this assignment is that I want you to kind of really take it and run with it, and it might look very, very different than the person who normally sits by you. So think about the found poem. Again, it's very much a creative assignment. You are pulling together lines or phrases from poems, stories, plays that we've read this semester to create your own poem or poems. You just have to have at least 20 lines. It can be 4 short poems or 1 long poem. So I know that I'm not giving you a lot of really kind of black and white, like here's what it should look like, because I kind of don't want to. I don't want to show you what something should look like when I want you to take it and run with it and make it look, again, very different than someone else's might be. So be creative with that assignment. And feel free to ask me any questions that you might have. Remember, with the found poem, you don't have to do a works cited page. Just at the end of the poems or on the back of the page, just list what texts you used. That's it. No in-text citations, no works cited page. So the next couple of weeks, you'll be reading. You had short stories to read for this week, but next week is all poetry. The reading is really kind of trickling down a bit, although still do read everything because you might find something compelling that you'd like to write about. You're finishing up your journal. You're reflecting on a selection of 8 readings, maybe more if you can't come to the Zoom classes. Remember that that's 8 total, not 8 every week, but 8 total from the time we moved online to the end of class. So you'll have that extra piece of your journal, your found poem, and then that final essay assignment is really where you're going to pour your energy. Next week, over the next couple of weeks, I'm really hoping that students will take advantage of having me proofread and revise a first draft. So we'll be in touch via email. I'll let you know kind of what that might look like. You can email me. You can email me the file. However you want to do it, do it. Let me look at a first draft, give you some pointers, and your final essay grade will be much higher, as you might imagine. Normally with the final essay in a normal class experience, I would require meetings for first drafts in the last week of the semester, but I'm going to make it optional. But please remember that if you utilize that option and you have me look at a first draft, you will have a much higher grade on your final essay. So keep that in mind. Okay, that's what's coming up. Those are the assignments. I just want to give a brief intro to what you'll be reading this week. So Cathedral by Raymond Carver. This is a short story. A few of these selections are very kind of loosely in the theme of relationships. So Cathedral is very much a modern story, kind of postmodern style. If you remember when we read Chuck Palahniuk in particular, this idea of minimalist fiction, this is an example of minimalist fiction. And you'll find in the first paragraph or so, it feels kind of hard to read at first because it's so very bare and realistic. We are reading how our protagonist is thinking, and it's not flowery, there's not a lot of description or adjectives. So we'll talk a little bit in our conversations on Wednesday how that feels to read that kind of very minimalist modern fiction. Look for symbolic acts in this short story. Why a cathedral at the end? What happens at the end? What is going on? Think about the scene of read carefully when they're eating together, when they pass around a joint together, like what's happening in these scenes. Think about the symbolism in these acts, and think about the characters as well. Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood. This is a very kind of non-traditional short story, kind of a choose your own adventure, very playful. So we'll talk about that more together as well. Kind of we tend to think of a story having a beginning, middle, and end, and this really plays with that structure in the context of life and relationships as well. The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin is a regional writer. Many of her stories and novels, she's perhaps most famous for The Awakening, take place in Louisiana in the South. So The Story of an Hour, we don't necessarily feel that as much as we feel from some of her other stories, but this is a very brief story, very literally, the story of what happens in an hour. I won't give away the ending, but we'll talk about what's going on in the story, why she feels the way she does, some of the irony that's used in the story. Chopin wrote at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, and she was a prolific writer, but did not have a great deal of kind of success and notoriety when she was living. Chopin's work really has gained a lot of notoriety in the last few decades, when women's literature and women's studies became more of a scholarly endeavor in universities in the 1970s. Chopin was really unearthed as a really important and iconic voice in American literature. And then You Fit Into Me by Margaret Atwood. This is a short poem that, in the time I've been talking about it, it's already longer than it will take you to read the poem. Again, use of irony and language to convey meaning. So we'll talk about that. And then the next two short stories that we'll discuss on Wednesday, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas and The Lottery. These are two examples of dystopian fiction. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about them because it's so important in reading them to kind of have the story reveal to you what's happening in the society. But when we talk about dystopian fiction, oftentimes we're looking at a story of a society that doesn't seem too futuristic. It's not as extreme as kind of science fiction, far into the future, doesn't seem familiar, perhaps. Dystopian fiction often seems familiar and is meant for us to think about the things that are happening currently in our society. So, very famous recent example of this is the Hunger Games trilogy. Suzanne Collins, the writer of that trilogy, says that she was inspired to write that series because when she was watching television in the early 2000s, she would see images of the Iraq War at the time. We were going to the Iraq War in 2004, and reality TV. And she just noticed kind of what we were entertained by, what we were being inundated with in our screens. And she took that to a kind of a logical extreme of kind of what happens in society. And that's typically what happens when we look at dystopian fiction. So read these examples and we'll talk about them more together on Wednesday. Okay. Sorry, these introductions to our readings weren't very satisfying because so much of it was, I don't want to tell you what happens in this story. So be sure to read these. We'll discuss more on Wednesday. If you can't come to the Zoom class, Take it to your journal. Remember, write brief reflections, things that you thought about, meaning that you gave to a story, questions you might have had. That's the point of that addendum to your journal, is since we can't be together in class, it's a way for you to kind of express and think out some of the reactions you had to your readings. So I'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Please let me know if you have any thoughts or questions. Have a great day.